Yeah.
interrupting you. So go right ahead.
Yeah. Do you want me to repeat that one or no? Not, no.
You can just
Okay, okay. So one is ambiguity. We don't know what's happening. So we look to other people, and everybody kind of has a poker face and they're trying to play it cool. And so no one gets help. So that's one. Two, diffusion of responsibility. And what psychologists often describe this as social loafing. And this is our tendency in a group setting that we often kind of reduce effort. Somebody else will probably speak up. Somebody else will probably do something. Somebody like, yeah, it's a problem, but it's not my problem. And that means that in large settings, we might say, oh, this is a problem. This is bad. Somebody should do something. But we don't feel like we should do something. It's not like our responsibility. And if, it's not ours, then that means that we don't step up. And that can even be true for people who are in law enforcement jobs if there are other people around who could step up, who could do something. And so that's the sort of second factor that we know it's a problem, but hey, it's not maybe I'm not the captain or I'm not in charge or I'm not the oldest or, I didn't arrive first. I actually wrote a piece. This is a little bit of a side, but I wrote a piece a few years ago, an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal. They had reached out to me after the Uvalde school shooting, in which people might remember lots and lots of police officers arrived at the school, law enforcement officers. So there were a ton of law enforcement officers there. But it was totally not clear who was in charge. Was it the local? Was it the state? Was it the border people? Again, so there were lots of different people. It was not clear who was in charge. And therefore, something like 80 minutes went by as teachers were bleeding, as kids were bleeding. Now, some of the people in that situation, were definitely, dead immediately. They were killed on impact. But there were also people who lived and died after being rescued who very likely would have lived if there had been more prompt interaction in that again. So that's this sort of second factor, is that sometimes we're like, this is a problem but it's not my problem, and there can be time that goes by. And then the third factor, and this is the one that I think hits most for most people. When I'm doing a talk on this, I often, have people raise their hand about, which one, has impacted you the most. And typically it's about, 25% of people in the first two categories, and then 50 or even higher percent in this category. And that is the fear of the consequences. We worry about the consequences. Now, in the case of the Uvalde school shooting, people probably worried if I go in, I could be shot. Like he has a gun and I could die. So there are times in which like we really worry about our safety. But there are also times in which we worry about other consequences. So if I speak up and am I the loud mouth? Am I going to be ostracized? And am I going to be said like I'm not a team player? Am I going to be, described as the whistleblower or the rat? And so there are other cases in which people worry about calling out problematic behavior or stepping up because doing so might mean challenging a friend, a colleague, a family member, et cetera. And so sometimes we're not so worried about physical safety. Sometimes we're worried about the sort of social consequences of that. And so those are the three factors. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'm going to go off script just a little bit here and just kind of invite the virtual room here, anyone to comment about, kind of in the training environment, how much of the resistance is sourced in this fear of consequence. I'm imagining that it is probably one of the largest in terms of the people that we're teaching to intervene. But I just want to pause and open up. Does anyone have a comment about that in terms of what you see in the classroom?
Can I come in?
Please.
Uh,
Please.
I see it every time I work with police officers. There's a question I ask very early on, and the question is, do some police officers need to lose their jobs? Right? So if their behavior is really bad, totally against the code of conduct, code of ethics, do some people need to lose their job? And you can apply that to a prison setting as well. And I know that individually, they all agree with me. But you can see that fear that Catherine talks about. The first thing they do is they look around the room, right? And they look around the room, they look for permission. Eventually some person will put their hand up and then everybody follows. And right at the start, it's really you see the impact of police culture, prison culture, because it's so deeply ingrained that it takes a long time for us to over unpick all these things that you're talking about, Catherine. Fear is massive. And can you explain to the group? But one thing I love from your book was when you brought in the neuroscience of social pain, how how people feel that as a pain, because that really just is a very interesting part of your book.
Yeah, I was actually going to go into that, and then I was like, "Well, I've been talking so long, so I won't go into it." Yeah, so thank you for giving me that very nice segue. So what's really interesting, and this is data that is new, like with the, we haven't had historically of sort of understanding, why does silence, why does speaking up feel so hard? So why do we sort of push to silence? And what's so interesting is that research now in neuroscience has shown that if you think about being ostracized, rejected from your group, it actually activates a specific part of the brain that is the exact same part of the brain that is activated when you experience physical pain. So when you twist your ankle or get a paper cut or, spill hot coffee on your arm or whatever. So it literally means that being rejected, hurt, ostracized, ignored by your group leads you to feel what the brain interprets as physical pain. And so I think what's really important about that, and this really, segues nicely with Graham's example, and that is that it's very easy for people to think, well, bad people, do bad things. Those were bad kids in my, son's dorm who didn't, call 911, or, those are bad police officers who didn't speak up, or, bad prison guards or whatever. But the reality is we are all hardwired as humans, as people, to worry about social pain, just like we're worry about physical pain because it's an evolutionary basis. And so that means that fearing this sort of ostracization, it doesn't make us a bad person, it just makes us human.
Wow. So powerful. And Matthew, thank you for your comment in the chat about sort of the role of culture as well and sort of creating some safety, right?
Hmm.
Some
Hmm.
emotional safety
Hmm.
around intervening.
Hmm.
And actually, so this conversation leads, sort of moving into this idea of courage. And we talk a lot about in the class, sort of distinguishing physical courage and moral courage. And we're sort of in this area, of course, of moral courage, which feels much more ambiguous than physical. Physical courage seems pretty like, of course, I'm going to go save that person, right?
Hmm.
Um, Catherine, what are the research findings that most challenge our assumptions about courage? I know we all think, of course, I would act, right? But what are some of the research findings that challenge that?
Yeah. So thank you for that question. I'm actually working on a piece for an online newsletter that will come out very soon on heroism. And so I've been like kind of digging into this topic, very much in terms of what influences people to act heroically. And the distinction when we talk about physical courage and moral courage is that physical courage is often about doing things that are brave. So you are putting your life at risk, and whether that's, going into a frozen pond to, save somebody who's fallen in, or, jumping into a burning car and, pulling somebody out, again, charging somebody with an assault rifle, et cetera. That those are heroic acts. But the distinction here is that physical courage is seen as wonderful and good. No one's like, oh, that person really should have let that child drown. Like, what were they thinking? So physical courage doesn't put us at risk of like, ooh, I'm not going to be liked. In fact, we call it heroic. That was really a heroic action in that way. And so it doesn't put us into this issue of feeling this quandary. Moral courage is in many ways a little bit harder because it means we're taking a stand. We're taking a stand, and that means we may experience some kind of consequences from that. Now, there are times in which moral courage and physical courage, of course, overlap. I think we can see that very clearly, frankly, in what's happened in some cases in, Minneapolis, in which people were, engaging in, physically courageous acts that were also kind of doing the right things and in sometimes, putting themselves in danger. The most famous examples of that, of course, are about the Holocaust, in which when, Germans hid Jewish people, that was moral courage, standing up to what was law enforcement, the Nazis, but it was also, of course, putting themselves at risk in that way. But to me, the most important sort of interesting finding about moral courage is that there probably are people who are predisposed to it. There are probably people who are naturally more what I call moral rebels. But, and this is really important, but there are things that we can all do. And this is things that, frankly, you all are doing, Liza and Karen and Abigail and Graham, who are in the field, doing this. They're things that we can also train. So there are probably people who have a natural predisposition, but there are also skills that we can all develop, just like we, learn skills in first aid or CPR or, et cetera.
Yeah, so powerful and such a driver, obviously, behind the work that we do is to really help make those moments of moral courage easier, right? Something it's a little easier to act.
Mhm.
So it's kind of shifting gears. We've talked a lot about, what gets in the way, what makes it hard. So what conditions make moral action more likely?
Yeah. So one of the things that I love, and in fact, I love the comments that I'm just going back to the chat.
Yeah.
I love the comments that both Graham and Matthew Woodhouse have put in, and that is talking about it. So what's so interesting is that the conversation that we're having right now, the conversation that people are having are in their departments with friends, with colleagues, whatever. That's what I really love. And so when I talk about this topic of moral courage and stepping up, et cetera. And I talk about this in public lectures. I do interviews, et cetera. This is what happens as soon as the talk ends. Somebody emails me or somebody comes up to me and they say, "Hey, I want to tell you about this time," or "Hey, there was this time," and it happens all the time. And this can be, I remember, I was on a school bus and there was this bully and I didn't speak up, or I remember I was at the airport and there was this kid who kind of like just they're all these different stories. And as soon as you sort of understand the psychology behind pluralistic ignorance, all of a sudden you interpret those situations differently. So, I'll be in a meeting now and somebody will say something, kind of problematic. And instead of looking around to see what other people are doing, I'm like, oh, I know that everybody else thought it was problematic. They just aren't going to show it. So I'm going to speak up and I'm totally confident that other people, feel the same way. So as soon as you start learning about this stuff, all of a sudden you're like, you interpret situations differently. It's not that when other people don't speak up, they don't think it's a problem. It's that they're worried about, being rejected, being ostracized, et cetera. So I don't have the fear of speaking up because I understand what's driving their inaction.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, so powerful. And that idea that people come up and share with you about the time. I know that happens in the classroom quite a bit too after training. It's
Hmm.
fascinating. As you know, in our program, we have people think about those times early on as a
Hmm.
way to say we've all kind of been in this position and not acted before. So it doesn't have anything to do with good or bad people, right? As you said,
Hmm.
it has to do with being human. So I
Hmm.
want to kind of open it up now to the group. And as your experience as facilitators sort of doing this work in public safety, which concept that we've talked about so far that's in the book really helped to kind of shift your thinking as a facilitator? Anybody have any personal stories to share about how kind of diving into the reasons behind active bystandership really kind of helped you as a facilitator? And feel free to just come off mute or even put it in the chat if that's more comfortable.
And I'll just say while people are sort of pondering, I think Bernadette's point in the chat about culture and leadership. I mean, culture and leadership, and the example that I often use, and this is basically a test of are you old or are you not old? But who remembers? I'll just do a little like show of hands. Who remembers when you could buy a seat on an airplane in the smoking or non-smoking section? Yeah. So this is like literally like I say this for my college students, and my college students are like, that isn't true. And I'm like, no, 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 that was totally true. And they're like, but how would the smoke know to stop? And I'm like, it didn't. That was like
Yeah.
actually like one of the problems, in that way. But I look at that as an example of culture that we just, again, the older folks on this call, we just grew up in which like, yeah, you'd buy like aisle or window, smoking, non-smoking. That was just what you did. And now that seems ludicrous. And so I think that when we talk about organizational culture, one of the reasons I love the work that you all are doing and, actively in the field, all of you are doing, and Graham, et cetera, is that this is about changing the culture. So the norm becomes protecting ourselves and our colleagues by speaking up, not by staying silent. It's really this shift of culture. And yeah, as I often say, ethical leadership flows from the top. So absolutely, you need to have the leader saying it. If the leaders are kind of like, well, we've got to do this, but that it just doesn't work.
Yeah, so huge. And at Heroes, I know we're doing so much work in creating development opportunities for those leaders, and how do we create
Hmm.
cultures that support this work?
Hmm.
Looking the chat here, yeah, and of course, people are talking about in the chat all of these organizational systems, right?
Hmm.
That allow this to happen. It's very difficult to teach active bystandership
Hmm.
to a group of professionals that then go back into an environment where it takes a Herculean act of courage to speak up, right? Those two things have to work together. Anyone else, a comment on that before I move on to kind of the next question? Let's see. Yeah, just again in the chat, we are here with
Hmm.
you. Yeah, this is an all of us kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, want to talk a little bit more about this idea of social conformity shaping silence in especially hierarchical cultures.
Hmm.
We teach in the program, of course, the influence of authority on people's willingness to act, or perceived authority on people's willingness to act. How does social conformity really work to further this culture of silence?
Yeah. So the wonderful thing about social conformity is it can go in two ways, right? So that's what I love. I love conformity because we can think about conformity, right? We can think about conformity in a lot of different ways. I think about that as, recycling. Like there are communities in which like everybody recycles because like that's just kind of what you do. One of my favorite examples that I describe in the book is how do you get people to reuse their sheets and towels in hotel rooms? Again, saving electricity, saving water. And very clever research at Arizona State University found that what was not effective was telling people, oh, hey, reusing your sheets and towels is really good for Mother Earth. What helped was saying 85% of hotel guests reuse their sheets and towels because they care about Mother Earth. So, what that tells us is that people don't care about Mother Earth, but they do care about social conformity. And that's, the sort of example is that you can increase voting not by saying, voting is being an American, voting is being a democracy, being like most of your neighbors vote and we're going to tally, whether or not you have that I voted sticker. So peer pressure is a wonderful thing because peer pressure can also lead people to say, oh, what we do here, is we speak up. And I'm just going to go back to one point that I wanted to make earlier, Karen, that I think is really relevant. And that is, when I saw the horrific images coming out of Minneapolis when Derek Chauvin was kneeling on George Floyd's neck, for 9 minutes, that was after this book, was written. The book had been published, so this is not in the book. But what occurred to me in that moment was there were three officers with Derek Chauvin. And if those three officers had have pulled Derek Chauvin off of George Floyd's neck, which they had a legal, ethical, moral responsibility to do, um, we wouldn't know who George Floyd was because he'd be living and working and walking around Minneapolis. But the other thing is that those three officers would probably still be officers, and they're not. And their lives have been dramatically changed and ruined by their inaction in that moment. And so it's also the case that when we talk about active bystandership, it's not being a rat, it's really protecting our colleagues. And that's the sort of shift that I think and Matthew has written in the chat that on the flip side, it's the newer staff that is ultimately more receptive to the modules in social science once you break through that initial trepidation. And so to me, that would be a very hopeful sign, right? That if this is sort of like, coming up, people are sort of learning, this perspective. I think that's very encouraging.
Yeah, yeah. I've always thought from a teaching and learning perspective, it's
Mhm.
so much easier to teach the way we want it early than to try to undo, like,
Right.
you know, what's become automatic later in a career. That's why, I think early development of leadership is so huge instead of like, oh, this is the way I've always done it, and now you're asking me
Mhm.
to undo all that. So that's great. Um, I would open it up to the class as well on this one. What have you all found, or what do you think are some good strategies to help our participants kind of move from, yeah, I agree with all this. This makes sense. Of course, we should be doing all this, to a real behavioral commitment to active bystandership. Graham, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Mm.
Yeah, in the book, Catherine, you talk about, I think, or in the book, I've read somewhere about John Davidio's research on cost-free benefits.
Mhm.
And, John basically says that if the costs outweigh the benefits, people don't speak up. So for me, one thing I try and do throughout the whole training, whether I'm doing able training, heroes training, or my own training, is to help people see the benefits. Because when
Mhm.
people speak up, we all benefit,
Mhm.
right? Everybody benefits. And I think helping people see the benefits, stopping harm, loyalties to self, family, loyalties to colleagues, profession, all these benefits very quickly outweigh the costs. And I think when you start to couple that with toolkits, when you start to break down the diffusion of responsibility, when you start to reframe loyalty, then you've got the perfect storm for action. Because you
Mhm.
said conformity can go two ways. It can go conform
Mhm.
and do nothing, but if you
Mhm.
create the right conditions. So this training that we do, that we deliver, it's not rocket science. I don't think it's rocket science. It's a
Mhm.
lot of it's common sense. People
Mhm.
know this already, but they
Mhm.
don't get to spend time in classrooms talking about it. So when
Mhm.
you're working with students, it's
Mhm.
about getting them talking to each other. That's what I try and do. I get them to talk to each other. So they start to share. We start to break down that pluralistic ignorance that you talk a lot about in the book. How do we get them
Mhm.
to see that if I stop my friend from losing their career, then I save their pension. I feel good. I'm being loyal to my dad. I'm being loyal to my parents who gave me my moral compass. So I think, when you do this training, don't just focus on the content, focus on the conversation you create and focus on the
Mhm.
benefits to intervening. And it's really helped me get buy-in because that's important. Buy-in is really important.
Mhm. I remember a conversation that I had with as part of my work with ABLE, active bystandership and law enforcement. My students a couple of summers ago were doing interviews with police officers across the country, and there was a sheriff in North Carolina who was pretty dubious about participating in this research project. And he asked if he could call me and, talk about it. So we had this like very nice conversation, during which he did call me a Yankee, but he ultimately at the end agreed to participate. And what he said was, I'm participating because it's easier to do active bystandership training than it is to have a press conference when something's gone wrong. And like that to me, like that's exactly in line, with Graham's, cost benefit analysis, right? Boy, that's a really unpleasant, situation to be the sheriff in which you're defending, something has really gone wrong.
Yeah, well, bring it back to the
Yeah.
personal consequence,
Yeah.
right? Which often drives us.
Hmm.
We've talked a lot about the role of culture, and I think one thing I'd like for us to have a conversation about and get people, especially those in the field out there teaching this stuff, how does understanding the psychology behind our willingness to intervene accelerate culture change? We just alluded to that, but I kind of wanted to go a little bit deeper. How does understanding that help us as
Hmm.
leaders, as members of an organization, accelerate the culture change that's required to support bystandership?
Hmm. Is that a question for me or for
Or
Graham or for
whomever,
everyone?
or
Yeah, yeah, that's
anyone, but if you have a thought, please chime in.
I mean, so what I think is so interesting, about this whole topic is that, and I remember actually having a conversation with Liza's husband, way back when, probably 5 years ago now, in which when he asked me to join the ABLE board. And I said, listen, I said, I know nothing about police officers, which is true. I know nothing about police officers. And I said, but What I do know a lot about is people, and police officers actually are people. And so are, people who are on a lacrosse team, and so are people who are in a corporate boardroom, and so are people in Congress, and so are people in, whatever. That I know a lot about people. And so to me, all of this stuff, and we've been focusing, of course, on the issue of how do people do it, within the scope of law enforcement. But the reality is all of this stuff is exactly the same in a million different situations that we're in. When you're in a college classroom, or you're in a high school classroom, when you're in a meeting and somebody says something problematic, when you're sitting around a dinner table and somebody says something, whatever, it's all around us. And so, so part of what I think is so interesting about this is that it can be sometimes intimidating to sort of think about this as like a training, for my job, and I have to do the right thing, whatever. But when you pull it out of that and you think, hey, were you ever on a school bus in which there was a bully and you didn't speak up? Were you ever, in a locker room and there was some locker room talk and you didn't speak up? Were you ever in a meeting in which somebody, whatever? Because the reality is, this happens in our personal lives. It happens in our professional lives. It happens in academia. It happens in, corporate boardrooms. It happens in cockpits. It happens in hospitals. It happens all over the case. And so I think sort of understanding the sort of breadth of it, right. I mean, so Graham just noted, yeah, every major news story can be linked to this work. And I think that's just true. I mean, I think it's right. How did Jeffrey Epstein, how did the Olympic gymnastics doctor get away with it? I mean, like, we can, Harvey Weinstein. I mean, it's again and again and again. And so I think it's not unique to people's a particular profession, because it's people. It's people.
Wow. I I have that same belief, Catherine, about leadership. If you don't understand something about humans, it's hard to lead humans.
Right. Right.
So, like, leadership is all about humans.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Matthew, you've been so great in the chat. Would you, I'd love for you to come off mute if you're willing and just kind of share your thoughts. You're putting so much great stuff in there. Would love to hear your voice if you're willing.
Sorry about that. No, I was actually in the middle of a separate meeting,
I'm so sorry.
multitasking a little bit. No, you're good. You're good. Like I was mentioning in the chat, one thing about, advancing this, like I said, is consistently asking people, how would you approach this? And I think once people open up and become more comfortable with communicating that, they sort of advance the message with their peers, with their own superiors, because, a big barrier to this is obviously leadership. It's getting our top into buy-in on it. Now, I'm not saying we can't break through to them, because I've had pretty solid mileage breaking into my vets and going, hey, you're listening to the science, you're, kind of shaking your head, what have you, but remember that time we did XYZ and afterwards everybody thought to themselves, heck, or that employee who's no longer with us, for a variety of reasons, and how we all said, yes, we saw it coming, and how we didn't really do enough to mitigate that disaster. That's when they start to have the breakthrough, even at the later stages of their career, by going, yeah, those things did happen. And for me, one is always more than zero. So if I can get even a single veteran staff member to buy in on this, and start moving that idea, that I've made the impact, even if they're saying it on the way out the door. But like I said, at least in our department, I've been getting a lot of great mileage with the new staff. We do it in our onboard academy, we hammer it in during our field training. It's something that we've been pretty aggressive about doing, because when they picked their team, I was kind of the odd man out. As a personal thing, I've spent about 10 years with my department. I was in the trenches, so to speak, for most of those years. And while being an instructor, I had no idea. I didn't really have a lot of insight on able or active bystandership. So when they chose me for this, I was like, okay, let's take a look at this curriculum. And once I sat in with the onboard with Abigail and started teaching it, I was 100% in. And ever since then, I have been hyping it up to anybody that will listen. I do think,
Yeah.
I do think the idea is to get that input from the new people, because we have a large number of new staff, to get that input from the new people and make them feel comfortable with giving their input to supervision, because I'm a first line supervisor. So the idea is they can come into the office and they can speak to me about this, and I can offer that sort of feedback to them that makes them feel comfortable. Even if they didn't make the correct decision, even if, it's something that they had to learn from and carry forward, it's, something that I try to work on. But yeah, sorry about that.
Graham, your person. Right here. That's great. Thank you, Matthew. That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. I'm wondering, just sort of back into like what's happening in the classroom, how we facilitate this buy-in. What are ways in which um, the curriculum, but really most importantly, the science behind it. Oh, and Anthony, I see your hand up, so I'm going to come to you in just one second. Well, actually, let me do that before I ask the next question, because you probably have something to add on that previous one. Go ahead, Anthony.
Mhm.
Well, good morning, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I wanted to join in the conversation to discuss some of the successes that we've had here in my department, and what I'm implementing in our classroom during our hero session. Obviously, we're given less time this year than we were last year, and I really was disappointed that we were given less time. I thought heroes should have been given more time, but hey, that decision's above me, obviously. So part of my role in my department is the review of every use of force incident within my institution as it pertains to applicable training and use of force compliance. So I do see 90% of the use of force videos, body worn camera, and the audio visual surveillance system here at this institution. And time again, I see officers being that bystander. They are moving knees. They are taking over escorts. They are, and they're not waiting for a supervisor to do it, and they're not waiting to be told to do it. So when I see those videos, my departmental policy is that I cannot show those videos in class, and I would absolutely love to show these success stories about how we are intervening in these very high tension, high stress situations, and stopping excessive force, stopping even before it starts. Stopping it before it even gets to that level. But what I do is take the officer that I know intervened, and when they're in class, I pull them aside and say, "Hey, would you mind if we discuss this during our heroes class?" I can't show you the video, but I saw you do this, and I'll pull them in my office and I'll show them the video. And I say, "Hey, tell me what was going through your mind when you did this action." And to date, this year I've done that 4 times, and last year it was up 6 times. And I know those numbers aren't great, but what would have happened if we didn't give this training? We didn't talk about it. We didn't put it in their heads. And talking about it, making it accepted, and then showing that it is actually happening has been a very, very key tool here at this institution to continue to proliferate this information and make sure everybody understands, hey, this is a good thing. And this is saving not just our integrity as a department, but our partners' money, jobs, and well-being. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Oh, Anthony, no, thank you for sharing that. I have just a quick follow-up question for you. I know you said you had 6 last year, 4 this year. Is there any sort of common thread of what people are sharing, like what was going through their mind at the time? Is there anything any sort of nugget that you can share with the group about sort of what is shifting?
I don't know if it's the culture, the video, the body worn camera. We've had them for 6 years now. It's not new. Just saving their partner. They wanted to end the scenario. The sooner it was over, the better. And if they left it the way it was going to continue. And that is a very common theme. They just wanted the issue to be over, and what they were seeing was going to cause it to continue, and they didn't want it to continue.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you. Any other comment on that before I move to the next question?
I did want to mention, Mr. Sotelo, that was great. There's actually a video in the curriculum that shows a public use of force where an officer is repositioning an individual's knee. And whenever I have a class that has veteran officers or people who have had experience with use of forces, I'll pause and replay that video and go, we all know this scenario. We have all probably seen this scenario. We've all experienced this scenario. And much like you, I review, use of forces and, footage, et cetera. And it's that same thing in terms of how your leadership, interacts, or your supervision interacts with your line staff to go, this was the right thing. You guys did the right thing, or we could have tightened this up, or we could have made this better, and having that reinforcement. But yeah, definitely kind of having the personal or departmental anecdote to kind of reinforce the curriculum helps, especially with the smaller jurisdictions, because, you get a lot of head shakes and that jazz. But when I show them that stuff, they know that feeling. They've had that feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that.
I do too. Nothing is more powerful than like the personal experience. And as Catherine was talking about earlier, the power of peer pressure. These early successes that can be broadly shared that really amplify that. And culture is not going to change like a light switch, right? It's a process. So the early adopters are so powerful, and the work that you all are doing as facilitators to really shine a light on and help people see this is happening in our organization is such an accelerator of culture change. I know we're coming up kind of on the last sort of piece of our time together, and I want to make sure that we have time to kind of assimilate what we've talked about and really think about how we're going to carry it forward. But before we get there, for the instructors and even Catherine, of course, how can the language from your book, the language of the psychology, the language of the social science, really strengthen credibility of instructors with a skeptical audience?
I mean, I really feel like I should turn this over to Graham. No pressure there, Graham. But I think Graham does such a nice job of talking about it in ways that are accessible. I mean, even in the chat, he's put in that little like cartoon image, and I think sort of understanding that the science is important because the science tells us this is why, but the science is irrelevant if you can't translate the science into action, in that way. And so I'm gonna call on Graham. Go. There we go.
On the spot there, Catherine. Thank you.
You're up for it.
The baton has been passed.
You have been a massive influence in my life, right? I interviewed you a few years ago, and your book has really massively influenced me in my work. And you talk about your son's experience. I remember, and I've shared this before with some people, I lost my dad to suicide in 2008. And in the days and weeks before he did what happened, the red flags were on display. And I didn't know what to say to my dad. I quickly passed it on to a doctor. I'd reached the end of my ability to have a conversation. And looking back, now I know exactly what I'd say to my dad. I know exactly the words I would use, the questions I would ask, the probing I would do. But I didn't know that back then. But I know now. And my job now is to articulate all the science that you bring in, because I firmly believe that deep down human beings care. They care. We care about other human beings. We're born emotionally connected to the world. But as we get older, we start to realize there's consequences of speaking up and helping people. But the science tells us, and I'm glad you've talked about the science. The science helps us overcome all the challenges that you've talked about, right? A lack of efficacy. So let's give people the tools. A lack of support. So let's create conversations where people feel support to speak up. Hierarchies being an inhibitor. Okay, let's encourage people in rank or with lots of service. Just give them, tell them to give permission. Affirming trust is the activity we do in enable. So if we can identify the inhibitors that are around us, then we can overcome them. We can work and learn to overcome them. And the conversations that everybody here will be creating in the classrooms are really important. They're conversations I wished I had back in 1987 when I joined policing, right? I remember doing the ABLE training for the first time in 21, 22 and thinking, why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we having these conversations? And I put a bit in the chat. People in corrections, in prisons, in law firms, in medicine, in sports teams are crying out for these conversations. And all the evidence and the science that Catherine beautifully articulates in that book, it's sitting on books behind Catherine, it's sitting on double clicks in computer screens. Our job is to articulate that, is to bring that out and make it practical. One thing I do a lot is link it to the news stories.
Mhm, mhm,
The everyday stories. You mentioned Weinstein, you mentioned, even the stuff that's happening in the US just now. We're all bystanders to a lot of horrible things. And we
mhm,
need to, because if we don't think we've got the power, then we give up. Apathy
mhm,
sets in. So we
mhm,
need to speaking up. So I think this conversation tonight is really important. And, you know, the conversations we create in our workplaces is really, really important because they save lives. Anthony, you talked about they save careers, they save
mhm,
pensions, they just
mhm,
save a lot of grief. They save a lot of paperwork as
mhm,
well. And I
mhm.
think, Matthew, Anthony, you talk about the benefits, helping people see the benefits of this training. And it's really encouraging to see other people in this room tonight who get it.
Mhm.
Once you see things, you can't unsee them. And that's the bug we've caught now. We
Mhm.
can't see what we already know now. So we've got our job is to be that hero where we go back into our world and talk about the lens that we have and help shape other heroes in the future. So yeah, thanks for tonight.
Um, I'm going to make one reference to something that Graham said, which I think is so important, and that's also at a very personal level, it avoids regret. So Graham just said, I wish I'd had the words. I wish I'd known what to say. And I will say that sentiment of regret, that we regret inaction. Inactions haunt us. What if I had? What if I was a colleague of Derek Chauvin and I had reported him for what he was doing 6 months before? What if I had pulled Derek? Like again, these haunts. And I remember a time I gave a talk on this, and a man came up to me afterwards who was probably around 40, and he said, I remember being on a school bus when I was in fourth grade, and there was a bully who was taunting this kid, and I never said anything. And my whole goal as a dad is to make sure that my kid confronts the bully.
Wow.
Like that, like it stuck with him, for 30 years or, whatever. And so regrets haunt us when we fail to speak up.
So powerful. Thank you. Thank you, Graham and Catherine, for sharing that. I have to drop off, so I'm passing the baton over to Liza to kind of wrap up this session. But I want to just sincere thanks to everyone in this session in joining us in this critical, critical work. And thank you for being part of the Heroes and Able family. And thank you, Catherine, of course, for sharing your time and expertise with us. Liza, I'm going to pass it over to you to finish us out.
Thanks, Karen. Mhm. Mhm.
And with that, Catherine, I'm going to, as we're coming to sort of a close here, I just want to ask you for some final reflections and just, give us your final thoughts on how we can all do better and how we can help those around us do better.
Mhm. Yeah, so thank you for that lovely question. So I wrote this book hoping it would make a difference. I mean, that's it. Like, and I hoping it would make a difference, hoping it would mean that a kid who was, unconscious in a dorm room, somebody would call 911 quickly. I wrote it hoping that, somebody, engaging in inappropriate, behavior in a fraternity house or a lacrosse team, would make a difference. And I hoped that it would make a difference in lots of different occupations, in police departments, in operating rooms, in cockpits, in Congress, in Epstein's, and so and so, Weinstein's offices and so on. But here's the thing: the only way it makes a difference is if we all talk about it. So that's why whenever anybody asks me to talk about it, I'm like, yeah, yeah, I'm in, because it feels so important. And as Graham referenced before, the reality is it's like all around us. So I talked about bystandership at a conference in Portugal in January, and it was a conference on media and courage. And while I was there talking about media and courage, the journalist Don Lemon got arrested in Minneapolis, and there were the atrocities that we saw with Renee Good, and so again, it's all around us. We can see it happening in our communities. We can see it happening in our workplaces. We can see it happening in our families. And the thing is that we all want to live in a world in which more people speak up in the face of problematic behavior. We want that world for our kids. We want that world for our colleagues. We want that world for our family members. And so all of us sort of talking about this research and talking about the psychology that inhibits us speaking up and acting actually helps us defeat it. Understanding the psychology is the essential piece of giving us courage and strategies for being able to speak up.
Yeah, yes, I can just, biggest clap in the world for all of that. I think it's great.
And sorry, I'm going to say one more thing because this is the kind of question I get a lot. That I also think it's important to recognize that there's not one size fits all. That there are lots of different ways that people can speak up in the moment. And I'm recalling a story that kind of went around on Twitter a couple years ago about a woman who was on a bus. I think it was a bus in Boston, and there were a bunch of people sort of tormenting her and kind of being rude and sort of bullying. I think it was a woman of color, and a random stranger went over, sat beside her, pretended that they were friends, and were like, "Hey, what are you going to do this weekend? Are you going to this party, whatever?" And then got off the bus when that woman got off. And so that's an example of, being an active bystander does not mean you have to stand up and say, "You're stupid, you're racist, you're dumb, you should have done this," whatever. It can be interrupting the moment, supporting somebody, a simple statement, "Hey, that's not cool. Hey, maybe you're joking, but that's not cool." And so again, I think it's so important that people have a repertoire of different skills, and they feel empowered to use what feels comfortable to them. It's not one size fits all.
I love that. I really love that. I love the example of the person on the bus. I mean, it's such a simple thing that just, where does that come from? It's
Mhm.
great. Really, really great.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, with that, I just want to say a huge thank you, Catherine. That was wonderful. And Graham,
And
everybody,
Graham, my co-presenter.
your co-presenter for the day. Yeah, I just want to say thank you. And I also, I want to just say thank you to everybody else that's here and all of the instructors that are listening to this and the people that'll be listening to this, or sort of asynchronously. Um, just, you have such an amazing and huge role in the culture change of your organizations. And thank you for doing that. And thank you for what you do every day. And I guess it's just the constant reminder that you're not just teaching a class, you're not delivering a curriculum, you're really shaping the way your organization functions and the norms and what expectations there are for everybody that comes to work every day. And not just at work, but at home and out in public and everywhere you are on that bus, right? It's everywhere. So I just say thank you to everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all of that. And please keep in touch with us and keep
Mhm.
sharing your stories with us because these are all great. It's all good to hear.
Mhm.
And with
Ethical
that,
bystandership is contagious, like COVID. So, that's a good thing,
but way better
Yeah.
than COVID.
But way better, but way better. Exactly. No
Yeah.
mask. Yeah.
Yes, we'll definitely
Thank you
take
so
that.
much for this invitation, Liza and Abigail, and Karen, and thank you all for taking the work and actually putting it into the field and making a difference in our world. So I owe all of you a tremendous debt of gratitude.
And with that, everyone go off and have a wonderful day.
Take care.
Thanks, folks. Take care. Bye bye. Good night.